Hello and welcome. Thank you so much for joining us for today's webinar, Reclaiming Retirement for All. My name is Mika Weinstein, and I'm the Director of Operations at Just Futures, the primary sponsor of this event. My pronouns are she, her, and I'm located on Piscataway and Nacotchtank land, also known as Washington, D.C. Chitra, you can go ahead and move to the next slide. If you haven't already, please go ahead and introduce yourself in the chat with your name, pronouns, your affiliated organization, if you have one, and an acknowledgement of the original caretakers of the land that you're on. We'd also love to hear, of course, why you joined this webinar today. Can move to the next slide. So we're going to cover a few housekeeping items first. If you experience any technical difficulties during this webinar, you can use the number on the screen to contact Zoom support directly. You can provide them with the webinar ID for this event, which is listed. And if for some reason you're having trouble getting in touch with them, you can contact Justine from our team for additional support. Right. This webinar will be presented in English. There are closed captions available, and you can I'm enabling them now. There are, as of right this moment, closed captions available. You can turn them on and off by clicking on the CC Live transcript icon at the bottom of your Zoom window. We are recording today's webinar, and we will share the recording with all participants and anyone who you want to pass the recording along to. If you want to submit a question during the webinar, we will have a Q&A portion at the end of the presentation. You should use the Q&A feature that is on that same Zoom toolbar rather than the chat, because we hope that there will be lively conversation in the chat throughout this presentation. We don't want to lose your question. So to make sure that we have it and can share it with our presenter at the end of the presentation, please make sure you do use that Q&A tool. So before we get into the main content, I want to share briefly about Just Futures and why we produce this research and event. Our co-founders, Alex Sangchin and Steve Choi, have worked for decades in movement organizing, the nonprofit space, and philanthropy. About a year ago, they came together with the idea for Just Futures after hearing from their peers and experiencing themselves a lot of unmet needs around retirement and investing. I'm sure it will come as no surprise that we'll hear about many of those unmet needs today. But the mission of Just Futures is to create a platform that connects nonprofits and their workers with investments that are increasingly aligned with the needs of people, communities, and our one planet. We are a people of color and gender diverse public benefit corporation, but outside of our staff and our own work histories, we do want movement governance. So we're committed to 30% non-dilutable ownership by nonprofit and social movement organizations that are working toward a just transition to a regenerative economy. Our first product offering will be a 401k retirement plan, which we're planning to soft launch later this summer. We know that the needs of our sector have never been a priority for the financial services industry. So one of our driving forces is building a retirement product that is purpose-built for nonprofits and other mission-driven organizations. The option to invest your values is only one part of that. It's a heavy emphasis for us, but there's a lot more to it. There's also cost, ease of use, transparency, and a bunch of other factors that Chitra is going to talk more about today. But to make sure that we didn't rely on our own experiences and assumptions, we commissioned the research that Chitra will be presenting on. And through this research, we validated our own experiences and also, as expected, getting input from over 200 organizations really expanded our view, not just of how we can create a better product, but also how we as a sector can work on moving risk and responsibility off of individuals and up to the collective level. We are really excited to share the details of those findings with you today. So I want to give a huge shout out and thank you to the co-sponsors of this event, Neighborhood Funders Group, who's our co-host today, Grantmakers for Effective Organizations, Full Spectrum Capital Partners, Jesse Smith Noyes Foundation, General Services Foundation, the Nathan Cummings Foundation, and Asset Funders Network. I think there will be some live tweeting of this event using the hashtag Reclaiming Retirement. So if you're into Twitter, if that's your thing, please do join in with that conversation. And I'm now going to turn it over to Chitra IR, who's the primary researcher on this body of work. Chitra, you can take it away.
Great. It is wonderful to be here today. As Mika mentioned, I was commissioned by Just Futures to explore a topic that is really exciting to me, which is pain points and challenges that nonprofits experience around retirement. I come at this work having spent my entire career in the nonprofit sector, most recently as an executive director of a small organization who was charged with figuring out retirement, found it incredibly challenging and exhausting. And so part of this process has been really validating to know that I wasn't alone and that we can do better. In terms of what we're going to do today, we'll talk, just to set us up, we'll talk a little bit about why retirement, why that's an important focus when we're thinking about broader issues around economic justice in this country, who participated in the survey. I think some of you are here, I can see from the chat, but who in general we're talking about when we talk about this survey that we conducted. Our findings, which are 4 gaps within the nonprofit sector around retirement, and our recommendations in terms of how to move forward. And as Mika mentioned, there will be a Q&A, and we're hoping to have between 20 and 30 minutes for that Q&A. So we're hoping for it to be substantial. So I encourage you to put in all your questions in the Q&A box so we can have a really great discussion after we go through our findings and our recommendations. But first, why retirement? And so as Mika mentioned, in terms of how Just Futures is thinking about this, one really important thing to think about is the amount of savings currently that are locked up in other plans that could be redirected into social justice investments. So there's a real potential here that doesn't currently exist in terms of what would it mean to really invest one's values. But in addition, really thinking about what's important within the nonprofit sector. When we think about retirement, right, it's an opportunity for those who've spent their career, right, in the nonprofit sector not to fall into poverty when they leave their work. I've had the personal experience, and I'm sure many of you had, of seeing many of our movement elders, right, who've really been at the forefront of so much social change. Later, after they step down, they are being funded by a GoFundMe because they need treatment, healthcare, or they need stable housing. And it feels just that there's a real lack of dignity and a lack of support, I think, for often people who have given their lives to the sector, of not an ability to continue on. So retirement feels really important so that people are able to maintain some standard of living even after they've done their work, as a way of honoring them, as opposed to this hoping that people can come together. I think the other thing that feels really important is that retirement, particularly for people who don't come from generational wealth, is that it offers one of the only pathways towards wealth accumulation, and wealth here meaning just, over your daily expenses. In general, right, the pathway to wealth accumulation in this country is about coming from wealth. So we know that people who come from wealth are most likely to continue their ability to get wealth, or you marry into it. Or in terms of work, that being an entrepreneur or an owner working at a really for a really high salary that allows you to invest in things, or working at places with stock options, those are ways of accumulating wealth. Those are often not available to people in the nonprofit sector. And so what we're left with is real estate, which has lots of question marks around it, particularly because of race differences, but also what's happened to the real estate market, and then retirement. And so what's really important is we all know about the racial and generational wealth gaps, is retirement offers one of the only ways to address that or mitigate that is available to people, particularly those who spend their careers in the nonprofit sector. The other thing that we know about retirement is that starting later becomes far more expensive. And I think that we're all probably really familiar with these slides. And I'm not a fan because I feel like they're often fear mongering because mostly they offer reminders of you should have done this thing earlier in life, you've messed up. At the same time, it's really important to see what a difference it makes if you start investing earlier so that a dollar that is invested in retirement savings at the age of 20 um, goes up to 488 versus investing it later at age 40. So when you start saving later, it's a lot more expensive. And this isn't to blame individuals, but it does mean as a sector that when people are starting out, it's a lot cheaper in some ways to set them up for success later. Similarly, this is showing the same things just in a slightly different format, is if we compare three people, all of whom save $150,000 for retirement, it makes a really big difference when they start doing that saving. So starting at age 25, they're both are not having to spend that much every year, $3,750, but we see how compounded savings, right, makes a huge difference here, the magic of compounded interest. And so starting at age 35, you're spending more per year to get to that 150,000, but also you have far less in savings. And so I say all of this to say if we understand that retirement is one of the only pathways towards people who don't come from generational wealth to start to accumulate something to offset that wealth gap. It also matters when you start and how much you put in. It makes a really big difference. In addition to when you start, the other thing, and we'll talk more about this in this report, is fees make a really big difference in terms of what happens to your savings. And so this chart, again, we'll be referencing this throughout, makes a really big difference of whether you have 0.5% in fees. What you see here is that you're losing an amount to fees. That's a necessary part of what having a retirement account is. But the difference between 0.5% and 2% is a huge difference in terms of what you accumulate. So it matters when you start, it matters how much you put in, but it also matters what your fees look like or your rate of return. So again, trying really hard not to fear monger, but just to say it has a huge impact, engaging in retirement and then the plan itself. So let's talk about who participated in our survey. It was really important to us to be representative. The Just Futures team largely comes from New York, DC, and California. So we are largely coastal elites. We know that the nonprofit sector, in fact, stretches across the country as a whole. And so we were really committed to making sure that we had participation across the country. What we see here is these little dots represent where organizations were headquartered, but the level of blue indicates what states they cover. So while we didn't have organizations based in every state, we did have them based in every region, and we did have coverage of the entire country with huge concentrations in New York and California, which is not surprising. We also focused on smaller organizations. The vast majority of nonprofit organizations are small, meaning they have less than 20 employees and budgets of $1 million or under. So we focused on those organizations who have paid employees is where we focused on. In addition, we did some oversampling. We wanted to really prioritize social justice and movement aligned groups. In doing this, we were very determined not to police organizations to say, are you really a movement aligned group? We let people self-define. And so over 80% of organizations identified as being social justice group and a slightly lower percentage identified as being movement aligned. We found that the vast majority of organizations were systems change or organizing groups, followed by direct services. In addition, we oversampled for leaders of color. We know from a lot of the research that about 20% of nonprofits are currently run by people of color. We had about 2/3 of our participants were organizations run by leaders of color. We did this so we could see the differences between organizations, and we know we would need to oversample in order to do that. And so these are two places where we oversampled. In total, we had 207 organizations where we were able to use their complete surveys. We disposed of surveys that were not filled out completely or had contradictory information. Of those 207 organizations, we had 143 who offered retirement and 64 who didn't. We oversampled again in terms of who didn't offer retirement because we wanted to really make sure that we understood what was going on there. So after we did the survey, we held a number of focus groups, follow-up focus groups, as well as interviews. And based on the combination of the survey, the focus groups, and the interviews, we have four gaps that we're identifying within the nonprofit sector: capacity, transparency, values, and equity. And we're going to walk through each of these now, starting with the capacity gap. I think one of these findings, which isn't particularly surprising, I think, to anyone here, is that you find that smaller organizations are far less likely to offer a retirement plan. The chart here is about budget size, but you could also overlay a chart on employee size, replace that under 500,000 with less than 5 employees, and you would get a very similar chart. Here it starts to go up. This would be like less than 10 employees, or between $500,000 and $1 million. But what you see is really these organizations that are under $1 million, a lot of them don't offer retirement, and then it starts to increase. And the organizations themselves would identify both the cost of retirement as well as a lack of administrative capacity as why they aren't providing a retirement plan. This is very similar in many ways to the for-profit sector, where small businesses struggle the most, both in terms of cost and administrative capacity. We really wanted to dig into what that means, this lack of administrative capacity. And what we found was the lack of administrative staff. And one of the things for the survey is we asked that the person with operational authority for the retirement plan be the person to fill it out. And if they didn't have a plan, we said, who would have operational authority, meaning who'd be responsible for making sure you're compliant, who would be in charge of training. And what we find is that for organizations who have a plan, and that's indicated by those in blue, it's most likely that the person with operational authority is not the executive director, and meaning that they are a CFO, a COO, a co-executive director, an operations manager, but it is somebody who has administrative responsibilities as the primary portion of their job description. So that there is another staff person who might be holding a lot, but still has a focus on administrative work. Whereas for the organizations who don't have a plan, it was mostly the executive director who was the person who was responsible. And what we find happens here is that executive directors, on top of these administrative responsibilities, are also in charge of fundraising, setting the vision, recruiting and managing the board. They may or may not be great at navigating the bureaucracy of retirement and administrative work. But at smaller organizations, you're often at the mercy of whether the executive director has this specific skill set, which may or may not be applicable to other work that the executive director is doing. And so the decision to bring on somebody with operational who's focused on administrative work is really crucial, but obviously there's a cost for that. And so that ability to bring somebody on to see the need for operations, which is important to see at an organizational level, but also important to have funders who support that, really ends up dictating whether people will have retirement or not. We had a number of people who said things like, I've been the solo staff member, so I couldn't do it. So if I'm the executive director, it just feels hard. I'm not going to do it. And it ends up being a little bit at the whims of the executive director or their specific talents. just because organizations aren't offering plans, it doesn't mean that they're not interested in plans. And so there's a quote here, but there were, I feel like, 10 or 20 quotes that we could have put here that really reflect that. One, it's hard to prioritize because we don't have that many people. There's not a demand for it, but also there doesn't seem to be plans for what we need, right? There's not a group that offers benefits for nonprofits at a reasonable price. There's not a way to set it up without it being so burdensome. So people, it wasn't that they were like, we don't need retirement. It was, I really wish there was, but there's not things that really meet our needs. And this was really interesting because, in fact, there are low effort plans. And low effort is a term we've come up with. You can definitely put in the chat if you have recommendations of other ways of naming this. What we're sort of referencing are plans in which there is not a high administrative burden. And specifically, we're speaking about plans like the SEP or simple plans, plans set up by Congress, where there is not any required reporting on the part of the business or the organization that has it, where there might be limited choices, but there's also limited costs and not much for the administrator to do. And part of what was interesting here is when we asked organizations who don't have retirement plans about their familiarity with plans, there was a good amount of familiarity with 401ks that do have cumbersome reporting requirements, also discrimination testing. There's a lot of involved with it, a slightly reduced amount with 403bs. But when you see the very familiar or even somewhat familiar question for the SEP and simple plan, two plans again that were set up specifically for small employers, including employers with just one employee, no administrative or limited administrative burden, right? You have less than 20% being even somewhat familiar with this, meaning that people don't know about the plans that might be most appropriate for them, right? So there's this significant gap here. It's really important for me, from my perspective, having been a really overwhelmed nonprofit executive director, to say none of this is intended to shame, right, nonprofit administrators. I think it's to reflect the level of overwhelm and the gaps in getting this information out there, that people don't know about the thing that might serve their needs because of the sense of overwhelm. In addition to a lack of awareness about these SEP and simple plans, there also was a lack of awareness of state plans, state facilitated IRA plans. Like there's one in Oregon called Oregon Saves, also Cal Savers in California. And then Massachusetts is really interesting, particularly because they have a plan that's actually targeted at nonprofits. We didn't ask about awareness of these plans in the survey, but I think part of what was interesting is, for example, that quote that we looked at before where someone was like, I really wish there was some kind of plan for nonprofits where we could share our burden. They were from Massachusetts. And in Massachusetts, there in fact is a plan, right? There's a state plan where there is a low fee option for nonprofits, but people aren't aware of it. So one of the significant impacts of this capacity gap is a lack of awareness even of the tools that might be relevant for you. And the bigger impact, which we shared at the beginning, is this idea of, well, if I work at a small nonprofit, I just might not get retirement for a few years. Maybe I'm early in my career, I'm just doing this for a short time. But what we know, again, is when there is a failure to contribute to the plan or contribute very much to a plan, people are put at a real disadvantage. So going for a year or 2 years or 5 years without a retirement plan has real negative impacts on the workforce who's working at these small organizations. So that's the capacity gap. Next, we're going to turn to the transparency gap. And what we see in some ways that seems like a contradiction here. More than 50% of organizations who offer retirement plans reported that their main driver in how they decided what the plan would be was the employer cost or the cost to employees. So there was a real concern, again, with costs, which makes sense. Nonprofits that were concerned with costs. At the same time, though, they also indicated that they didn't have a regular practice of looking at fees and or they had not reviewed their fees in the last year. So we have a thing where at a starting point, organizations, when they start a retirement plan, are like, we are very concerned with costs. But then on an ongoing basis, they don't seem to be checking into those fees. And that has real implications. One of those implications is because costs in general have been reducing in part because of technological advances. And if you're not aware that you could be getting the same services for cheaper, you're in fact spending more as an organization, and perhaps more significantly, your employees are paying more. Fees are complicated. That's why I have said there are many kinds of fees, but in general, just for purposes of our webinar, I've broken it up into 3 different kinds: administrative plan fees, investment fees, and individual service fees. Administrative plan fees can be paid either by the employer or the plan, which is not really a person, which really means via participants. Investment fees are paid by participants, and these individual service fees, for example, if you're trying to withdraw money from retirement, can be paid by participant. I want to really focus here on administrative plan because this is where an employer does have some choice in the matter. And what we found is for many of the organizations we surveyed, employees were paying administrative fees. So for 40% of organizations, they said that they shared administrative fees, meaning that they were paid in part by the employer, but also in part by employees. In addition, right, and this is a fairly significant number, is 18% of organizations didn't actually know. And again, I'm going to repeat that there's no intention I have here of shaming. I think this is true for me when I was an administrator, that I wasn't sure. And part of the reason that one can be unsure about how administrative fees are divided is because it's really challenging to understand the language that is given. And so this is an example that one of our survey participants provided us about, which is a fee disclosure. So this fee disclosures are something that the Department of Labor put into effect, I think almost 10 years ago now, after protracted litigation, a lot of lobbying against this from the financial service industry. But the big win was financial service providers, retirement plan providers are required to disclose their fees. The challenge is they could disclose it and it still might not be understandable. So there's a lot going on here. Part of what's going on is there's a combination of percentage amounts as well as dollar amounts. And so trying to figure out how much this actually means in fees is really hard because you have to go back to see what's the total that you're taking the percentage of and add it together. And so it can be, I think, really challenging. You can look at this and then it is always going to involve more work to actually figure out a number because you can't combine terms that are not like, so you can't combine percentages and dollar amounts. So you need to actually do a good amount of math to get there to figure out what the fee actually is. The second thing, which is even more challenging, is this language, which says that some or all of these fees may be offset. So if the question here is who is paying for these fees, is it the employer or the employee? They in fact aren't telling us. They're like, it might be the employer, it might be offset, it might not be, right? So you could read this, fully digest it, and then not know because it says may, right? So you actually aren't finding out who's paying for it. And finally, in terms of how it is going to be offset, it says revenue sharing from plan investment options, which if you are reading this and you haven't been steeped in retirement literature and understanding it, it can feel like, okay, it's from the plan, some neutral, third entity. But in fact, what that often means is it is coming from participants. There's some really good research around how fees have been hidden. There's a great report that got put out last year by a group called Employer Fiduciary, which we cite to in our report, which finds that 91% of retirement plans have hidden fees, most often in the form of revenue sharing. And so we find that a lot of times that the revenue sharing means that plan participants are paying for it, but they don't actually know. So this combination means that it's really hard to know what the fees are. And I think more significantly is even if they disclosed this and you were to understand it, it's really hard to know what the long-term impact is. And I apologize for a moment, I'm just going to go back up to the slide I shared at the beginning about impacts, because I think it's really important to look at here when we talk about, sorry about this, fees. Okay, here we go. Is retirement plans really like to show you these kind of charts, I would say, right? There's lots of shaming of how old are you? You know what you're too old to do, save a lot of money. You better get started. Retirement plans, I feel like, and you can put in the chat if you have been shamed by these and it makes you feel bad about yourself. That happens a lot. I think the charts that we never see provided by retirement plans are the long-term impacts of fees. And so that fee disclosure we were just looking at, that, the text, there's lots of confusing terms there. But even if you figured it out and we're like, okay, right now I am paying 1% in fees right now, it equals this amount. All they're telling you is for a specific moment what the impact is. What they are not showing is what the long-term impact of those fees are, right? Because similar to the way that your savings get compounded, these costs are compounded over time. And so knowing the amount of the fees at that moment is one thing, but what's actually really important, and again, I shouldn't actually say no one ever shows this. I'd be super curious to know if anyone's plan providers provide this and saying, here are the fees and here's how it's affecting you over the long term, is there's real losses that happen to people because of the fees. And I think one of the things that happens when people get to the age of retirement, and so this chart is showing at age 65 what you have. And so if you've been paying 2% in fees, you'll have 243,000. Because there's not a provision to you made that says, well, here's what happened to fees, here's what you have left. I mean, although I'm not sure at that point the use, except you could feel sad about it. But people often don't know. They just think, oh, this is what I've gotten, 243,000. There isn't a clarity that someone has been extracting that money and you've actually suffered a loss. And because of that, there isn't necessarily anger or frustration about it. It's sort of, well, this is what I have in retirement. And so one of the things that feels really important and part of what we found through this process is just even looking at this and being like, wait, what's happening here? And how come I've never seen this? Is making sure that we're explaining that something is being taken from you in retirement. It isn't just that you are saving less. And so the fees, that lack of transparency, it's about understanding your fees at a given moment. But in addition, I think there's a huge lack of transparency and no obligation for retirement providers to provide any information about the long-term impacts of that. And I'm just going to move forward. Just going to fast forward for a second to, thanks for your patience, to the next slide. Okay. I'm going to go to the values gap now. So that was the transparency gap. In terms of the values gap, one of the questions we asked a number of questions about plans and how people felt about plans. So we had 8 different indicators. The second lowest score was on this question of how would you characterize whether the alignment between investment options in your retirement plan and your organizational values. And so on a scale of 1 to 5, people put a 2.84, meaning there isn't that much alignment between what you have as options of what to invest in terms of retirement and also your organizational values. At the same time, which is why we've called this a contradiction, 75% of organizations reported that they are satisfied with their investment options. So what's happening here? I'm sharing some quotes because I think this gets at when we interviewed people, what people are really reckoning with is this bottom one is I would love to provide this magical plan for my team, but I don't think one truly exists. So people are not dissatisfied necessarily because they're like, I can't really complain. I'm just dealing with reality. Um, Similarly, there's a fear that, like, if I had to support good causes, I don't want it to sacrifice returns. I don't want to be punished financially. And this quote is about someone saying individually, I don't want to be punished. We also heard a lot of administrators saying, I don't want, even if I ideologically feel really committed to this, I don't want to burden the employees. So more important to me than having something that values aligned is that there be choice, because it's not fair to force this on people. But in general, there was a deep interest in it, a clarity that there's a lack of alignment, but also a sense that nothing exists like this that could happen. So what we see is kind of a hunger and a desire, but also a feeling of we don't know whether this exists. In addition to the specific investment options within a retirement portfolio, we also found a real values alignment gap in terms of retirement advisors. And this was the single lowest score that a plan received, was on this criteria, that on a scale of 1 to 5, how engaged are your employees? It's 2.49. It was really low. This sentiment of like eyes glazing over and very, very hard to understand is like, I feel like it's this comment times 1,000. It's really boring. And then it's really challenging to understand. Nobody is engaged. And then I think this was maybe the most common sentiment. But then again, a number of people also were saying, we can't relate to the advisors who are coming. They don't seem to reflect us. We're mostly getting sort of straight white men, and also straight white men who don't work at nonprofits and are talking about retirement as sort of like stepping back and seeing what you've earned and traveling. And this doesn't seem real to us. And so the impact of this is just a lot of disengagement, of sort of reinforcement that retirement is for these other people who can understand this training, who look like the person who's providing the training, but we heard very little about quality training. We did hear that some people had great experiences with their plan providers that was primarily around responsiveness. If we have a question, they'll answer us. We didn't actually get a single example of really quality training from a provider. We did have places where the administrators would step in and try and do their own training, not their job, but feeling like there's such a gap, we need to bridge this, I'll do it. But there just doesn't feel like there is any incentive for current providers to really provide quality training. And yeah, lots of examples of boring and challenging. And I'm sure many of you have experienced this as well. I think the best comment, which I didn't type here, but I thought like summed up my experience, was like the people who come and do the training feel like they are bored of their jobs. And I was like, oh, that's right. They're even bored of it. And it feels obligatory, but none of it feels engaging and relevant. Finally, we turn to the equity gap. And so we talked about the fact at the beginning, the capacity gap, that not everyone who works in the nonprofit sector has access, because not all organizations are providing retirement benefits. And so smaller organizations, because of capacity, a lack of capacity as opposed to a lack of desire, are often not providing it. In addition, even at organizations where they are providing retirement, not all staff have access to it. And specifically here, we're talking about part-time workers. And so we found that in general, the most frequent sort of way that retirement is provided is to all full-time workers. The majority, of organizations do provide it to some part-time workers, but we only have, a little bit under a third where all full-time and all part-time workers are eligible to receive retirement benefits. And so given that we also know that part-time work tends to attract people with more precarious financial situations, whether they be caregivers, whether they have other additional responsibilities or limited opportunities. I think we know that essentially part-time workers are often in a more financially vulnerable state, and it often gets reinforced on whether or not they get access to retirement, even at those organizations who offer it. In addition, right, it could be that you do get access, but you're not participating. So what we found is, on average, for organizations that are providing retirement, only 70% on average of eligible participants are enrolled. And I say on average 70%, but I really want to emphasize the line on the bottom, which is we weren't seeing that, everybody was sort of around 70, like it was like 65 to 75. It was actually a really wide range where we had a number of organizations who offered retirement and had less than 25% participation, and then a number of organizations that had 100%. So rather than it being that everyone's sort of hovering around this, there was sort of a really wide range of participation levels in plans. And so we wanted to dig into that to try and make sure we understood what was happening there. And we found that the single largest factor that contributes to participation was around employer contribution, where plans with an employer contribution have greater participation than those without an employer contribution. And then even within employer contribution, there's significant differences, so that plans with a guaranteed or a non-elective contribution, where basically you might have to sign up for the plan, but that's all you need to do, and then you're given it, have greater participation, which makes sense because the employer is putting in the money, than plans that have a conditional elective contribution, or what we often call, I think in parlance, a match. So that if there's going to be a match, what that means is a certain amount of people aren't going to participate because they can't put in enough money to activate the match. But if it's a guaranteed contribution, they're still going to get the money. While in general, access to retirement plans are linked to size of organization, these specific factors around participation, plans with an employer contribution or a guaranteed, these aren't linked to size of organization. The factor that we found that actually contributed to these are around whether organizations were POC led and white led. And I offer these definitions here. These come from Building Movement Projects, and it's an attempt to broaden our definition of POC led to move beyond just who the executive director is, but actually thinking about overall staff leadership and board leadership. And so what we find here is, all things being equal, meaning regardless of size, regardless of what type of organization you are, regardless of your geography, POC-led organizations are more likely than white-led organizations to extend retirement benefits to part-time workers. So 80% of POC-led organizations extended benefits to some or all, versus 44% of white-led organizations. And similarly, POC-led organizations are more likely to offer a guaranteed employer contribution versus a conditional employer contribution. I think these are really interesting to look at because there's been, within the sector, there is a lot of talk of the importance of diversity. And I think what we see here, these really concrete examples of how that plays out in terms of policies within the organization. On its face, whether or not you extend retirement benefits to part-time workers, or whether or not your employer contribution is guaranteed, isn't a racist decision, but it is a racialized decision. And if you are someone who recognizes that not everyone can contribute at the same level because you've had your own experience with that, you might have policies, right, that are more inclusive. And I feel really excited about this finding in terms of just these concrete ways in which there are differences based on the lived experience of who's in leadership at the organization in terms of what equity looks like. In addition, one of the things that we found that was really interesting is when we spoke to organizations who didn't have full employee participation, we asked a question of, are you trying to increase participation? And 75% of organizations who currently don't have full participation had not introduced any workplace initiatives, right? So what's interesting here is this real sense that we found that when there is limited employee participation, or just when employee participation is not full, the vast majority of employers either didn't have capacity, I think that's real, or did not think it was their responsibility to figure out participation, right, to increase it. The other thing we found was that for the 25% of organizations who were doing things, they often were focused on doing more trainings. They talked a lot about increasing financial literacy. And in many ways, they acted as if the responsibility was basically of like, we need to help these employees who don't know much. They didn't see it as a structural issue. Rather, they saw it as a shortcoming, on the part of employees, but they needed to train them, improve their financial literacy, as opposed to shift something in their plans. And what this misses is a lot of the structural issues within retirement plans. And so we wanted to go through a list of these because I think this is really important. Because when we focus on training and financial literacy, I don't think these things are bad. I do think that it places the onus or the burden, or it problematizes employees as opposed to a broader structure. And so what's useful to think about is there's lots of options within retirement plans, and how these plans are designed can really have an impact on whether the retirement plan an organization is offering is reinforcing a racial or a generational wealth gap, or it's in fact offsetting it. So one of the realities is, for people who don't come from generational wealth, is they have higher expenses. The leading higher expense is going to be student loan debt payments. But in addition, Building Movement Project, one of the things they found is that Black or Latino workers within the nonprofit sector are more likely to be supporting more than themselves with their salary, whereas white workers are more likely to have more support than their salary for themselves. So again, if you imagine someone is starting their career, they have a salary. If you are Black or Latino, it is more likely that you are supporting more than yourself with that. So you have more expenses. And if you're white, it's more likely that someone else is supporting you, whether that be a partner, a parent, or somebody else. The impact of this is that chart that we saw in the beginning, is that you might not be putting in money because you're paying off student loan debt. You're supporting your cousin, you're supporting your parents, right? You don't have the money. It's a really big deal if the only way that you get the employer contribution is through the match, because you are probably unlikely to be able to maximize that match. The plan design can really work to reinforce or offset this. For example, you can have automatic enrollment in a retirement plan, meaning that people are enrolled when they start. So the default is that you are enrolled in it, as opposed to having to make that affirmative decision to enroll in it. Escalation means as your salary goes up, it increases the percentage going to retirement. Again, rather than waiting for months of like, oh, I'm going to do this, it defaults you into it. So you can always opt out, but it means that you're not going to lose money. I think the biggest thing, as we already talked about, is whether there is an employer contribution and how that employer contribution is structured. And finally, how the fees are divided, right? Are employees having to pick up some of these administrative fees, in which case, even if they're putting money in, it is reducing their long-term savings. The second big factor is around lack of trust in advisors, which is known among retirement experts as investment risk. What we find is that often people, if you are getting advising or training from some kind of planner or advisor, it matters a lot whether or not you trust that advisor. Currently, I think about 3% of financial planners around retirement are Black or Latino. So if you are Black or Latino, it is unlikely that you'll find somebody who looks like you. We also had heard before in the values gap section that it's very hard to find someone who understands nonprofits. It's hard to feel that people understand what it means to be queer. And when you don't trust, you often default to low risk investment options, meaning that if someone who doesn't look like you, who you don't trust, says, oh, you should really choose this high risk investment option, it's like, thank you, but no thanks. I'm going to choose and go with what I know. Low risk. A low risk investment option means that you're going to get lower returns. And in practice, it ends up acting like a fee. You get lower returns on your investments. And so there's a real question of whether the trainings or advisors are engaging the staff. Again, if you come from generational wealth, you likely get financial advising from relatives or private advisors that your family has. If you are the first in your family to go to college, the extent to which you're getting advising is usually through your employer's plan. And so it makes a really big difference whether or not you can relate to the advisor. Finally, is what we call life cycle moments and emergencies. Life cycle moments are sort of key moments in your life, like having a baby, buying a house, where your expenses go up. If you come from generational wealth, you're most likely to get what's called an Inter-Vivo wealth transfer. That just means you get money from your parents who are living. You're not waiting for them to pass away, but time these life cycle moments. Oh, you're buying a house. We're going to help you with the down payment. Oh, you had a baby. Let's help pay for childcare. So it means that you're most likely to get a transfer of wealth from family members at this moment. If you don't come from money, you're most likely to have to withdraw from your retirement savings, which is known as a leakage risk, meaning money is coming out, is often not replaced. And so you end up with lower savings. In addition, there is considerable research about primarily Black and Latino families and what are emergencies and the extent to which, if someone else has an emergency, not a life cycle moment, but just somebody needs money for this, you're more likely to have to provide it. And that might mean either pulling money out from retirement or paying it, but not having money to put in retirement. And so often what that just looks like is your long-term savings are lowered. And so apologies for the grammar error. One of the questions that we need to ask is whether there's penalties for borrowing from the retirement plan. And is there a separate emergency fund that people could borrow from that aren't retirement? So again, all of these are plan design elements that, depending on how you structure, means that even if you offer a retirement plan, right, that's one step towards equity. Extending it to part-time workers is one step of equity, but then there's all of these other aspects that can end up reinforcing a racial wealth gap. And so that the retirement plan, in fact, benefits those who already have more. And so these are some ways of thinking about it. So ultimately, when we look at all of these gaps, the 4 gaps, capacity, transparency, equity, and values, we end up with sort of a pervasive sentiment that retirement is not for us. That's operating at 4 different levels. On an ideological level, it's the sense that building wealth is bad. And I think this often gets reinforced by the folks who are providing retirement trainings. It's like, oh, I'm not planning on having, drinks in the Caribbean when I retire. Like, I can't relate to it. And this is for those kinds of people, not for me. And I care about movements. I'm not trying to build wealth. And I think there's a real need to figure out rebranding. Maybe we think about retirement reserves versus wealth, but this real sense of like, this isn't right. Institutionally, I think what we find is for nonprofit organizations that, spending money on retirement increases your overhead costs. And that while there has been a movement in recent years to say that, having high overhead is not a sign of being less effective or less committed or less down, it still happens, right? That it's sort of, why are these costs so high? Aren't you trying to focus on the people? And so that you might not receive certain kinds of government contracts if they're not building in that overhead cost. You might not receive money from certain funders. You might get lower ratings on these charity rating, things like Charity Navigator, if your overhead is high. And the reality that smaller organizations have less infrastructure. And if you're lacking an operations person, you don't necessarily have someone to take on the administrative burden of retirement. Interpersonal, in terms of how we interact with people. And so this is, right, often going to a retirement training is like, oh, right, similar to what I said with ideological, is just like, I don't understand what's happening. And rather than being like, they are wrong, they should be doing this in language that I can relate to. It can just be like, you know what, this retirement stuff is like for other people, not for me, not for movement people, not for grassroots people. There's also these beliefs, I think, that often come out whether or not people say them, which is like, well, if you were really committed, you wouldn't be focusing on retirement, or you wouldn't be focusing on your wages. Like, why are you asking for so much? We're here to serve the people. And then in terms of participation, it's this sort of sense of like, well, they just aren't interested in savings for retirement, rather than looking at all the generational wealth reasons people might not be participating. So when we see that 75% of organizations aren't trying to increase participation, there are interpersonal messages of retirement's really not for you, right? It's not about it. And probably most sort of damaging, and I think the ways in which we reinforce these inequalities, is this way in which it gets internalized in all of us, whether we be, just workers or administrators within the nonprofit sector, is, and we saw this really, really pronounced throughout the survey findings, and I'm really excited that we'll have a lot of quotes on this in the report, is this real sense of like, if we are working on increasing wages, if we are working with very poor people who have nothing, spending money on retirement benefits will take away from it. And so this real kind of thing that people feel really stressed about, this reduces my commitment, whether or not the people around them are saying it, it is an internalized fact. And just, what will people think of me if I'm focused on retirement? Do I seem selfish? We had a few organizations who said, well, our peer organizations don't offer retirement. And rather than saying, oh, we should offer retirement, right, it might be a competitive advantage, we'll recruit people, it was sort of, they'll think we are not as committed if we start spending on retirement. What will people think of us? And so this internalized one feels really real. And you can feel free to share in the comments if you have any of this, or if you've managed to sort of escape the hold of these beliefs. And so what do we do with all of this? Broadly, I think there's sort of three parts. One is recognize, and when we say there's all this like internalized or this sort of pervasive sentiment, it's really important to recognize this and name it. Also, one of the instincts that we often have when we recognize problems in the nonprofit sector is to say, we'll just do it ourselves. So if these nonprofit administrators don't know about these plans, they should find out about it. And I think the answer is no. The answer cannot be that those who are the most burdened have to take on more. In fact, the costs, both the financial costs of retirement as well as the information costs involved with finding out about appropriate plans, finding out about how this promotes racial equity, those costs have to be subsidized. And so there is a need for others, right, like funders and intermediaries, to subsidize both the financial and the information costs. And finally, there's a need to organize and make demands around recognition of the nonprofit sector as employers and the importance of retirement generally. So just a little bit of a deeper dive into these. When we're talking about recognizing, we are saying that the nonprofit workforce really has to grapple with the fact that all workers deserve retirement, right? Including part-time workers, including workers early in their careers, workers at grassroots organizations, right? It isn't that retirement is something saved for fancier, more established institutions. Again, I think it's really important to remember that investing early in retirement makes a really big difference. So the idea of, oh, you'll catch up later really puts people at a disadvantage. And so it's really important to be like, we're talking about all workers, not some. Employers really need to understand the importance of starting early, as well as the role of fees, particularly these administrative fees. So choosing to share fees puts your employees at a disadvantage, and puts them at a disadvantage that they might not even realize, right? So the onus is on employers, because employees may or may not make that demand because it's really hard to know. And finally, for funders and intermediaries, right, it can't be that right, one of the really important takeaways from this is not saying something like, oh, retirement is really important, so we're going to ask you now, hey, are you providing retirement? And if you don't, we're going to ding you, right? It can't be used as sort of a sword or as a judgment. It has to be of this isn't because organizations don't want to, it's because there's insufficient administrative capacity. So what can we do to offset these costs, as opposed to how can we incentivize organizations to provide it, right? Because if it's too expensive, both in terms of labor or money, people aren't going to do it. So specifically, yes, subsidizing is covering the cost of administrative fees. Again, if these are shared, it puts employees at a detriment. making employer contributions, recognizing that early investment makes a really big difference. And also that this lack of financial service providers that reflect the sector as a whole is a real problem, and that there needs to be a pipeline of that gets funded and supported. For intermediaries, by which we mean sort of nonprofit associations, capacity builders, technical assistance providers, really think the focus here is around reducing information costs. So what does it mean, to know what types of retirement plans are actually available for you? What does it mean that rather than every organization having to do a training for their workers, if intermediaries held, workshops for the nonprofit sector as a whole, so that workers could really start to get empowered about understanding it? And one of the things I've said here is provide training by nonprofit specialists. I don't think this is true for all nonprofit associations, but it turns out that a number of associations, the way in which you learn about retirement, the sort of training provider is often somebody who is in the private sector who offers to do a retirement workshop for free. And maybe they'll get, some people will go to them then, and that's how it works out. But often those trainings are boring and eyes glaze over. And so it's really important, rather than just saying, well, they'll do it for free and they'll make it relevant to the nonprofits, that there's actually people who are grounded in the nonprofit experience, understand how to speak without jargon, who are providing this. I think that's really crucial, that we stop relying on sort of donated services of the private sector in order to be who is providing this. Like, we need high quality training, and I think high quality politicized training of the relevance of retirement. And finally, in terms of thinking about organize, right? What was interesting is we looked at a lot, there's been a huge rise in nonprofit unionization and nonprofit demands as part of the work in looking at the issues around retirement in the nonprofit sector. We looked at a lot of the demands. And what was interesting is that retirement wasn't necessarily showing up as a primary demand. That said, I think there is an incredible amount of labor consciousness currently within the nonprofit sector. And I think part of the way that this is going to happen is leveraging that and making sure that this is not a top-down approach. Oh, you poor people, you need retirement, but actually, again, a political historical understanding from nonprofit workers that retirement should be a public shared good that they deserve, and there should be a demand for it. For employers, I think, again, a sector-wide approach. So rather than trying to figure out how do we figure this out from our budget, how do we figure out how to do these fees and understand what values aligned options are there, is sort of saying, hey, are these nonprofit associations, these capacity building organizations really need to step up to serve all of us rather than us taking it on ourselves. And so really recognizing that every organization having to do this on their own is really inefficient. And finally, I think there's just a lot for the sector as a whole, this is my all, of recognizing nonprofits as employers. I had spoken earlier about some of these, what we were calling low effort plans, the SEP and the simple. If you are a small business, you receive a tax credit, I think of up to $5,000 a year for starting a new plan. If you're a nonprofit employer, there's no financial incentive for you to provide it, even though there's a high volume of small businesses or small organizations that are run by nonprofits, but there's no incentive because nonprofit employers are not recognized as employers the way that small businesses are. So the government isn't creating incentives. There needs to be far greater regulation of financial service providers. So that's not just around disclosing fees, but questioning how these fees are being charged, how they're being calculated, why small organizations are at a disadvantage, why financial service providers are benefiting those who already have money with retirement, but a real willingness to get out there and do a lot more advocacy work. And then, Social Security, which has always been an important prong of retirement security. It is in all of our interest to ensure that's funded, right? Not just limiting our focus to employer provided benefits. So that was some of the highlights of the report. I really thank you for staying on so long. The report itself, we're hoping to release in early July, which will have a lot more detail about all of these. And in the report itself, there'll be a lot more content around the political history of retirement. It felt hard to get into here, but sort of recognizing how retirement started, what does it mean? And the title around reclaiming retirement for all is very intentional. It's not something new, but in some ways it's more that there's been a collective amnesia for maybe the last 20 to 25 years where we are thinking, oh, we need to get better at this, forgetting that there was a time and a place where the vast majority of Americans had retirement and they were not in charge of bearing the risk of it. So we will have political history, and then we'll have a lot of benchmarking available for a lot of nonprofit organizations. So we'll have a lot more specifics of at every given size, what type of plans are organizations offering? Are they offering a guaranteed contribution? How much is that contribution? So really specific, I think, in more detail than we often find, so that organizations are able to see what their peers are doing, particularly in terms of size, because we recognize that that's a large factor. And with that, I think I'm closing.
Yay. Thank you so much, Chitra, for all of that amazing content and analysis. We do have time for a few questions. If we don't get to the question that you submitted, we are going to share our contact information, both on a slide at the, in a few minutes here at the end, and then we'll also send a follow-up email with that. There were a few questions here about encouraging participation. So one of them focuses on how do you encourage staff to participate when they're aware of the benefit, they know there's an employer contribution, but they still just don't seem interested in it? And then there's another one that's, kind of similar. How do you encourage folks to continue to invest even during those personal life cycle moments, or if there's market volatility?
Sure. So I think in some ways, part of it is if you reframe the question of how do we ensure that people are continuing to accumulate retirement savings when they don't yet see the benefits and they have other expenses, right? And part of it is you guarantee the contribution. So rather than the employer contribution being a thing that you need to prove yourself to deserve, so you've proven you care about it, it's sort of maybe provide it and then people will catch up, but not making it conditional feels really important. In terms of emergency savings, I think this is something I should be more explicit on the subsidy slide. I think it's really important. And this can be either at an organization or a sector-wide level, is to say, here is an emergency loan fund for individuals who need money for these specific life cycle events, who need money for this, but are not having to pull from retirement. There is a trend within retirement plans now to say that there's two kinds of plans. There's the retirement plans and then sort of a savings plan where a certain amount goes into that allows you to withdraw without any penalty. So I think at a basic level, you can help employees so that they have their own savings to pull from that aren't penalized. As an organization, you can have a fund or just pay people more so they have it. But as a sector, we can really think about what does it mean to have a sector-wide emergency fund. And again, if part of the commitment of the sector is really thinking about racial wealth gaps, this reality of what an emergency does to people across different races is really huge. And making sure that there are some buffers built in feels like a really concrete effort that can go a long way. But again, I think not saying that someone has to be interested in order to get the retirement savings, because again, there's such a cost there because it means that they lose out on those early years. And so why do you need to prove it? Like, why not provide it and then work on their interest versus making it conditional?
Great. Thank you so much for that response. We have someone else who asked, or they shared, as a millennial, I've been socialized not to rely on Social Security as a viable option for retirement at all. There's this narrative, it's going to run out, we aren't going to have access to it. So how do we shift that narrative that Social Security automatically won't be available to us, or, just gain more agency in this area?
That is a great question. I think, what I will say is I think millennials are leading the way in many ways, right? So if I ask the question, how do we talk more about mental health? how do we talk more about the importance of, flexible work schedules? I feel like millennials have led this way in making a lot of shifts within the nonprofit sector. How do we talk about unions? I think millennials have led this conversation. Retirement has been interestingly absent. And I think part of it is we need to start providing a lot more political education about the reality of Social Security, that Social Security out of any government program is the single largest program that is most likely to offset the racial wealth gap. We, in fact, are not necessarily running out of Social Security, but talking about it in that way is a way to diminish its importance. And there are ways to look at the numbers and see what's possible. And that thinking of employer provided retirement, not as a substitution, but as a supplement to Social Security, so that Social Security funds can primarily be used to support those who are most in need. One of the specific demands that can be pushed for is to increase the amount of income when you're earning that you provide money to Social Security. So Social Security, when you're paying payroll taxes, it stops, I think, currently at 138,000. And so once you make over that, no money goes into Social Security anymore. Often people who are earning above that don't need Social Security, so they're not interested in financing it. But if that Social Security income level went up, Social Security would end up being even more progressive than it is. It is progressive, but the way that the income level stops ends up making it in some ways a regressive measure. So part of it is to be like, everyone should be paying into Social Security, regardless of whether you need it. But then I think the other thing is really building on, to your generation, the millennial push around nonprofit unionization and these real shifts in working patterns we see, and to see retirement again as a crucial part of the racial wealth gap. I think there's been a really inspiring amount of labor consciousness as well as racial consciousness. And I'm like, but I think retirement is where these two, I mean, I'm biased, but I do think that retirement is where these economic justice and racial justice connect in the workplace, is retirement far more than salaries. And so given that millennials, right, I think have been at the forefront, I think continuing to fight for it, but also really good political education that connects those dots and really explains how retirement is not an add-on, but is a fundamental way of addressing or perpetuating the racial wealth gap.
Great. Thank you, Chitra, and thank you everyone for coming. We are out of time. I know there were a few questions that didn't get answered. I'm going to put up our contact information in a moment. I want to thank our co-sponsors again for helping to make this event such a success. And like I said, there will be a follow-up email with a recording of this webinar, the slide deck, and our contact information if you want it. Justine is sharing a link right now in the chat to a very brief session evaluation. We would love to hear your feedback. One super quick plug before we close. Just Futures has been hosting a series of webinars that are focused on social justice investing. So the first two sessions already happened. You can watch the recordings at the link that Justine is also going to be sharing in the chat on our website. And then the final session in this series is coming up on June 22nd. And we'll talk in that session about how Just Futures is trying to democratize access to regenerative economy funds using retirement savings. So that gets at, I think, Marlena's question in the Q&A, but also happy to connect before then. If you have questions for Chitra or I, please do feel free to reach out directly. And for more information on Just Futures, you can visit our website. Thank you so much, everyone. It was great to see all the engagement in the chat, and we look forward to continuing to engage.